Hello everyone, I'm Professor Paul Carrier of the Western Michigan University Thomas M. Cooley Law School, and what I'd like to do now is to provide some information that will be helpful as you are preparing for Class 11 of our Contracts 1 class this term. As you recall, we have been dealing with damages for approximately 2 weeks now, and this would be our third week on damages. Therefore, as you can imagine, it is a very important topic. We began by considering the nature of damages, for example, the distinctions between what is a restitution damage, what is a reliance damage, what is expectancy damage, those being the general damages. And then we talked about the possibility of also receiving special damages for basically consequential damages and incidentals, which do not necessarily naturally flow from a breach, but often do. And when we look at these special damages that do not necessarily flow from a breach, we have to ask ourselves three particular questions to determine whether or not they are awardable in a particular breach scenario. Those three tests are, and we covered the first two in last class. Certainty. The damages have to be somewhat certain enough for a court to get its mind around in order for them to be awarded. In other words, they cannot be speculative. And one of the best examples is the concept of new business profits. If you have a new business and you have no track record of profitability, and yet there is a breach by the other party, can you charge your lost profits to that other party? And the answer is yes, if you can prove it with sufficient certainty. But if it's still relatively hard to determine and not necessarily likely, then courts may not allow that kind of consequential damage for the lack of certainty. All right. The second element we covered last week, and you might recall the Hadley versus Baxendale case, was foreseeability. It is not fair for a breaching party to be responsible for certain risks of consequential damages or incidental damages of which he, she, or it is not aware. If something very bizarre could happen that the breaching party would have no idea about, it's not fair to put the risk on that party. And if there is some kind of damage that could be consequential or incidental that doesn't naturally flow, and yet one party really wants that to be part of his damages, if he or she or it experiences a breach, then he, she, or it is quite welcome to put that in the contract itself by telling the other side, these are special, strange damages that will happen if you breach. And that would give the other party the ability to either raise the price to pay for insurance or to walk away from the contract. Okay? If on the other hand, a consequential breach is readily known, likely to follow, or somehow disclosed already, and then with that knowledge, the breaching party goes forward with signing or forming the contract, then he, she, or it, in fact, should be responsible for those damages for their foreseeability. The final issue that we cover, or the element that we cover with regard to special damages, is their avoidability. There is a duty at common law now, and certainly in the UCC under Article 2, for the non-breaching party to mitigate damage, to try to avoid damage where possible. And that would be the third element. So you've got certainty, foreseeability, and avoidability. Okay? The main concepts that we're going to cover today. The first one is, if you have an executory contract where there is ongoing completion, ongoing fulfillment of the contract, for example, a construction contract, there may come a point in the middle of construction where there is a problem and the party that ordered this construction may need to breach, may need to stop, may need to pull out of the deal. And that's not saying that he, she, or it won't pay damage. But the key question then is, should the non-breaching party in the midst of performance stop at that point? Or should that party continue to perform? And in the old days, you could continue to perform and charge the contract price. The rule has changed, and you'll see this in the Rockingham case. There's mention of an American rule, where in an executory contract, if one party informs the other to stop because there's going to be a breach, the other party, in fact, does have a duty to stop at that point to the extent that it would actually mitigate damage. That's not to say that damages would not be awardable, but it's just the idea that the non-breaching party doesn't hurry up, doesn't continue, does not make it any worse than it has to be. Okay? So keep in mind that. There is one somewhat obscure exception to same. The idea being that if you are in the process of doing something as an executory contract and you are told to stop so that you don't increase any damages, it may actually be commercially reasonable to actually finish. For example, half of a baseball diamond is not worth anything to anyone. But if you finish the baseball diamond, you might be able to sell that to a third party and thereby at least attempt to mitigate damages by finishing the construction. That is a particularly UCC Article 2 concept that I'll try to bring up in class when we go over that material. Okay? But keep in mind the idea of this avoidability. Parties need to act in good faith. They need to act reasonably. And even at common law now, they have to stop. They have to avoid damages that could be avoided by acting reasonably. Okay, and so you see one party that rushes forward to finish the contract, which raises the amount of damage that might have to be paid, that could be problematic. We have an employment case with regard to a movie called Bloomer Girl, where Parker was denied a very specific role, and the studio that hired her for the role offered her another role for the same price, but a very, very different kind of movie in a genre that she probably did not like. And did not necessarily help her career at all. Furthermore, not filmed in LA, but in Australia. So then this actress would actually have to fly to and stay in Australia for quite a few weeks. And the rule in that case ultimately is that the breaching party employer can, in fact, help avoid damages by providing other employment to the non-breaching party employee. However, there has to be a reasonable alternative and not something disparate. And so playing in a Western in Australia is much, much different than a Tony decorated actress and Broadway play expert, in fact, doing a Western instead of a song and dance movie involving a very famous lead female character. So the female role for this character in the movie Bloomer Girl would have been significantly better for this lady's career, and the movie in Australia with the Western theme would not be quite so flattering. Okay? There was a strong dissent in that case, which you may want to look at, though, because people could differ on that, factually. Okay? But, for example, if you are a lawyer and the law firm promises you a one-year law contract and it runs out of money and tries to throw you out and you're mad and you complain, and then it says, well, don't worry, we can pay you half price and we can save half of our losses because you can become our janitor. Well, I'm sorry, those are too disparate, and you would not be required to take a janitor's job. You could simply look for another lawyer's job, do your best. But if you don't find one, the employer, if he's the breacher, would have to pay you for that 1 year as an attorney, and then can't try to substitute the performance for something that's really, really different. Okay? Today we also cover, and in class 11 we will also cover, a concept called liquidated damages. Liquidated damages are damages that parties estimate before they finalize their agreement. So, for example, every time a renter leaves my apartment early, it always costs me $700 to find a new tenant, to advertise it in the paper, and to get it cleaned up quickly. So it's always $700. I could start in my contracts from that point to add a liquidated damages clause, which is, if you leave early, it always costs me roughly $700. So you will pay me $700 for the breach, plus any lost rent that you still owe. And you have to be very careful with liquidated damages because they're estimated at the time of contracting, right? Not at the breach when we see how much the damages really are, but at the time of contracting. And so even though they're legally permissible, they're watched very, very carefully, and there are elements that you might be able to draw from a close reading of Restatement of Second of Contracts 356, which is in fact also in your casebook. What do you do for liquidated damages to fly? 1, measured at the time of contracting, right? The X, Y, and Z. See if you can pull out those elements and have them ready for the point where we meet in class and we can talk about those. Another tangentially related issue is the concept of penal damages. Penalty damages are not favored. They are possible, but they are not favored, and if I may say so, they're probably less favored even than liquidated damages calculations or formulations in a contractual relationship. We want to put the non-breaching party in the position that he or she would have been in had the contract been fully performed. We don't want to penalize somebody for being a bad person, for being a bad contractual partner. That is not what the law does. That is not what the law likes. And so, if courts find that some aspect of damage is a penalty, courts tend to throw those out. Not always. Okay? But you need to take a good look at the damages that may be penal or punitive, because if so, they have to go through another difficult set of tests. Let's talk a little bit about some of the more complicated cases. In the Lake River Corporation case, the problem there was this really a liquidated damages clause, which the courts may allow under the test I alluded to a minute earlier? Or does this really represent a penalty and with no good justification? If it's a penalty, it's out. If it's a liquidated damage, it might survive. The Schertz versus BMW case mentions the possibility of getting punitive damages and the reasons why for things like bizarre fraud, malicious interference, and these relatively heinous activities on the part of the breaching party. It is hard to get but possible, so you look for something above and beyond an ordinary breach. Okay? Be careful how you say this, but it's kind of like bad faith acting on steroids. It's not just bad faith, which would get a non-breaching party ordinary damages, but bad faith on steroids might allow a punitive damages award. When we get to the Hibsman case with regard to the automobile, there was evidence of bad faith, and because of that, the question of punitive damages and how much they should be, in fact, was able to go to the fact finder, which in this case was a jury. If time permits, I might talk a little bit about the Florida economic loss rule and its demise. Finally, and I won't cover it much in this presentation because it's relatively complicated, and we will work on it in class significantly. It's not that hard if you just are careful and clear as you go along. But there would be damages under the Uniform Commercial Code. If the buyer breaches and the seller is looking for damages, the seller could take the goods not purchased and resell them. And then the price, the expectation damage, would be the resale price less the contract price. So we see how much he lost on the resale, plus incidental damages, less expenses saved. And that would be under UCC Article 2-706, right to resell. If the seller does not resell, then it would be market price at the time and place of tender, less the contract price, plus incidental damages, less expenses saved. Subsection 2 of 2708 is called the lost volume seller provision. So for example, if you have a warehouse and you lose a sale completely, you don't have to try to resell. You should get money for that lost sale because you're selling out of a warehousing. There's also the possibility in certain cases of an action for price, which is specific performance. With regard to the seller's breach, where the buyer gets damages, buyer could try to cover, go out and buy the goods, and then it would be cost of goods when you repurchased, minus contract price, plus incidentals, plus consequentials, less expenses saved. If the buyer doesn't cover, then it's the price at the time the buyer learns of the breach, less contract price, plus the others. There is also the possibility of specific performance in the form of replevin. We'll see you in class.